So today I want to talk about something that I think is the most important question of this entire war. Not who is winning, not how many strikes have been launched, not what Trump said yesterday or what Iran threatened today. The most important question is this: can America actually stop this war? Can it negotiate a ceasefire? Can it withdraw? Can it find a way out? And the answer, when you look at it carefully, is deeply unsettling. America is trapped. It is stuck. It cannot go forward and it cannot go back. And today I want to explain exactly why step by step in simple, easy to understand English. So let us begin part one. This war has its own momentum. The first thing you need to understand about this war is that once a war like this starts, it develops its own momentum, its own logic. It stops being something that politicians and generals control, and it starts controlling them. Think about Ukraine. That war started in February 2022. And from the very first weeks, both sides knew that a negotiated settlement was possible. Both sides knew that continuing the war was causing enormous damage, enormous suffering, enormous economic cost. And yet, 4 years later, that war is still going, still grinding, still destroying lives and economies on both sides. Why? Because once a war starts, stopping it requires one side to accept something deeply painful, to accept loss, to accept humiliation, to accept terms that feel unbearable. And that is something most governments, most leaders find almost impossible to do. This war in Iran is going to follow exactly the same pattern. Neither side will concede defeat, even when it is clearly in their best interest to stop. And this war could drag on for years and years. That is not a prediction. That is a pattern, a historical pattern that repeats itself over and over again. But here's what makes this war even more complicated than Ukraine. Even if America wanted to stop, even if America decided today that it wanted a ceasefire, it cannot, not because Iran will not negotiate, but because the terms Iran would demand would be so devastating for America that accepting them would be worse than continuing the war. Let me explain this trap very carefully. Part two, the ceasefire trap. So let us imagine America decides it wants to negotiate a ceasefire with Iran. It picks up the phone. It reaches out through back channels, maybe through Oman or Qatar, and it says, let us talk. What does Iran say back? Iran says, fine, we will stop fighting. But here are our terms. First, America pays Iran approximately $1 trillion in reparations. $1 trillion for the destruction caused by this war, for the decades of sanctions, for the economic damage inflicted on the Iranian people. Second, and this is the critical one, America must leave the Middle East permanently, pack up its bases, withdraw its forces, remove its military presence from the entire region forever, because Iran's position is very simple. The only way to guarantee Iran's long-term survival is to ensure that America can never come back and do this again. Now, on the surface, some people might say, well, maybe that is not so bad. Maybe America should leave the Middle East anyway. But here is why that thinking completely misunderstands the situation. The moment America leaves the Middle East, a chain reaction begins. A chain reaction that will be catastrophic for the American economy and for American power globally. Let me walk you through this chain reaction step by step. Step one, the GCC becomes Iran's client states. Right now, the GCC nations, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, they exist under American military protection. America guarantees their safety. America is the reason they can function as independent nations. The moment America withdraws, that protection disappears. And the only nation in the region with the military power to guarantee the safety of the GCC and to control access to the Strait of Hormuz is Iran. So the GCC nations have no choice. They become client states of Iran. They fall under Iranian influence. They have to make their peace with Tan because without American protection, Iran is the only game in town. Step two, the petrodollar collapses. Now, here is where it gets really serious for America because the GCC is not just a collection of oil-rich desert nations. The GCC is the foundation of something called the petrodollar. And the petrodollar is the single most important mechanism keeping the American economy alive. Let me explain this simply. The GCC sells its oil in US dollars. Every barrel of oil that Saudi Arabia sells, every cubic foot of gas that Qatar exports, it is all priced and sold in US dollars. That means every nation on earth that needs Gulf energy, which is most nations, has to hold US dollars to buy it. That creates a permanent global demand for US dollars. And then the GCC takes those dollars it earns from selling oil and recycles them back into the American economy. It buys American treasury bonds. It invests in American financial markets. It funds American debt. This is the mechanism, this petrodollar recycling that allows America to function with $39 trillion in debt. $39 trillion. The American economy is essentially a Ponzi scheme. It relies on foreign nations continuously buying US dollars and US debt to keep functioning. And the petrodollar is the engine that drives that entire system. Now, the moment the GCC falls under Iranian influence, what happens to the petrodollar? It disappears. The GCC no longer has any reason to sell its oil in US dollars. It no longer has any reason to recycle its earnings back into American markets. The entire foundation of American financial power collapses. And remember, America is sitting on $39 trillion in debt. Without the petrodollar, without foreign nations continuously buying US dollars, the American economy cannot service that debt. It cannot function. The consequences would be catastrophic. Step three, Japan and South Korea remilitarize. So now let us look at what happens in Asia when America withdraws from the Middle East. Japan and South Korea are watching everything that is happening right now very carefully. They're watching America struggle in Iran. They're watching the limitations of American military power being exposed in real time. And they're asking themselves a very uncomfortable question. If America cannot win decisively against Iran, can America really protect us against China, against North Korea? Can we really trust our entire national security to a nation that is clearly overstretched and struggling? And if America then withdraws from the Middle East, that question becomes impossible to ignore. Because if America is willing to leave the Middle East when things get difficult, it might be willing to leave Asia too. So Japan and South Korea have no choice. They have to remilitarize. They have to build up their own military capabilities. They have to stop relying on American protection and start protecting themselves. Japan, which has been pacifist since World War II, is already talking about the most significant military expansion in its post-war history. That process accelerates dramatically if America withdraws from the Middle East. And here is the consequence for America. Japan and South Korea remilitarizing means they are spending their resources on their own defense instead of buying American weapons and supporting American military infrastructure. Another blow to American economic and strategic power. Step 4, Europe makes peace with Russia. And now let us look at Europe. Right now, Europe is supporting America's confrontation with Russia in Ukraine. It is paying enormous economic costs, energy costs, military costs, refugee costs to maintain that position. But Europe is watching the Middle East very carefully too. And if America withdraws from the Middle East, Europe draws one very logical conclusion. If America is withdrawing from the Middle East, America is retreating. America is pulling back. America is no longer the reliable guarantor of global security it once was. So why are we, Europe, continuing to fight America's war in Ukraine at enormous cost to ourselves? Would it not be in our best interest to negotiate a peace treaty with Russia as soon as possible? Before things get even worse, and the moment Europe makes peace with Russia, the entire Western alliance system that America has built over 80 years begins to fracture. NATO loses its coherence. American strategic dominance in Europe evaporates. Another devastating blow to American global power. Step 5. The US dollar loses reserve currency status. So now let us add all this together. The petrodollar collapses. Japan and South Korea stop supporting American military infrastructure. Europe fractures from the Western alliance. What does all of this mean for the US dollar? It means the US dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency. Nations stop holding dollars. Nations stop buying American debt. Nations stop recycling their earnings into American markets. And America, sitting on $39 trillion in debt, has absolutely no way to service that debt without the global demand for dollars that reserve currency status provides. The American economy is deeply intertwined with the global financial system, relying heavily on the continued demand for US dollars and US debt from the rest of the world. This doesn't mean it is a simple Ponzi scheme, but it does mean that global confidence in the dollar is absolutely critical. If that confidence weakens significantly, the consequences for the United States and the global economy would be severe. And this is where the strategic trap begins to emerge. Because when you look at the current conflict through this lens, you begin to understand why withdrawal is not a simple option. The cost of staying in the war is enormous, financially, militarily, politically, but the cost of leaving abruptly under pressure or perceived defeat could trigger cascading geopolitical and economic consequences that are even more damaging. This is the dilemma, not a choice between good and bad, but between bad and worse. The United States is not completely trapped, but it is operating inside a very narrow corridor of options, each with serious risks. Now we come to the next phase of the problem, escalation. If a clean exit is difficult and a negotiated ceasefire comes with heavy concessions, the pressure naturally shifts toward doing something decisive, something that changes the momentum of the war. This is where the idea of a limited military operation begins to look attractive. A targeted strike, a symbolic victory, a move that appears strong, controlled, and effective. One scenario that has been discussed in strategic circles involves targeting critical Iranian infrastructure, particularly oil export facilities such as Carg Island, which handles a significant portion of Iran's oil exports. On the surface, the logic is compelling: disrupt Iran's oil revenue, and you weaken its ability to sustain the war. You apply economic pressure quickly, you demonstrate strength. Domestically, it can boost morale. Internationally, it signals resolve. But the problem is not in taking such a target. The problem is in holding it. Carg Island sits close to the Iranian mainland, well within the range of Iranian missile systems, drones, and coastal defenses. Any attempt to seize or permanently disable it would expose American forces to continuous attack. What begins as a limited operation could quickly become a defensive struggle just to maintain control. And once you are forced to defend a position under constant pressure, the logic of escalation takes over. To protect forces on the island, you may need to suppress threats from the nearby coastline. That leads to strikes or even deployments on Iranian territory. But the coastline itself is backed by more complex terrain, including mountain ranges such as the Zagros Mountains, which provide natural defensive advantages. From there, the situation can evolve rapidly. What started as a limited strike becomes a broader campaign. What was meant to be contained begins to expand. This is the classic pattern of mission creep. History provides clear examples. During the early stages of the Vietnam War, the United States initially deployed a relatively small number of personnel with limited objectives. Over time, as conditions on the ground changed and pressures mounted, that presence expanded dramatically into a large-scale conflict involving hundreds of thousands of troops. Not because that was the original plan, but because each step created new pressures that made the next step seem necessary. Underlying this dynamic is a powerful psychological force known as the sunk cost fallacy. Once significant resources, lives, money, political capital have been invested, the cost of withdrawing feels greater than the cost of continuing, even when continuing may no longer make strategic sense. Leaders do not want to admit that previous sacrifices did not achieve their intended outcomes. And so the commitment deepens. The United States has encountered this pattern before, not only in Vietnam, but also in conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. And the concern among many analysts is that a similar dynamic could emerge again under the right conditions. At the same time, there's another critical layer to consider: the nature of the military balance itself. The United States possesses one of the most advanced and capable militaries in the world, designed for rapid dominance, what is often described as shock and awe. This approach emphasizes overwhelming force, precision strikes, and the ability to disable an opponent's command structure quickly. It proved highly effective in certain contexts, such as the early phase of the 2003 Iraq War. But Not all adversaries fight in ways that allow that strategy to succeed easily. Iran, for example, has spent decades studying U.S. military operations and adapting accordingly. Rather than concentrating its forces in ways that make them vulnerable to air power, it emphasizes dispersion, mobility, and resilience. It invests in asymmetric capabilities, drones, missile systems, underground facilities, and regional networks of allied groups that are specifically designed to complicate conventional military superiority. Even highly visible symbols of American power, such as aircraft carriers like the USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, and the USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78, operate within this strategic environment. These are extraordinarily powerful platforms, but they are also valuable and potentially vulnerable assets. In a high-risk environment, commanders must balance their use carefully, which can limit how aggressively they are deployed. This does not mean that the United States would lose every war game or that defeat is inevitable. Such claims are often exaggerated, but it does highlight a key point. A conflict of this nature would likely be complex, costly, and unpredictable, with no guarantee of a quick or clean outcome. And that brings us to the broader question. What should be done? To answer that, you have to step back and look at the global context. This conflict is not happening in isolation. It intersects with tensions involving major powers such as China, Russia, and ongoing geopolitical competition across multiple regions. The international system itself is in a period of transition, moving away from a unipolar structure towards something more complex. In that environment, a strategy based purely on military dominance becomes harder to sustain. It stretches resources. It creates multiple pressure points. It increases the risk of unintended escalation. An alternative approach would involve a greater emphasis on diplomacy, negotiation, and the recognition that multiple major powers have legitimate interests that need to be managed rather than suppressed. This does not mean abandoning alliances or interests, but it does mean adjusting expectations about control and influence. In practical terms, that could involve reducing reliance on constant military presence, reassessing how economic tools like sanctions are used, and engaging in broader negotiations that include not only allies, but also competitors. The goal would not be to win in the traditional sense, but to create a more stable balance where the incentives for large-scale conflict are reduced. This kind of shift is not easy. It requires political will, strategic patience, and a willingness to accept outcomes that may feel less than ideal in the short term. But in a world of increasing complexity, it may offer a more sustainable path than continuous escalation. So when you step back and look at the full picture, the situation is not one of absolute inevitability, but it is one of constraint. The options are limited, the risks are real, and the choices made in moments like this can shape the global order for years, even decades. The most important question, then, is not simply whether the United States can win or lose this particular conflict. It is whether it can adapt its strategy to a changing world, one where power is more distributed and where long-term stability may depend less on dominance and more on balance. And that is a question that even now does not have a clear answer.